Hello everybody, welcome to the Brazen Serpent. Today we're going to be continuing our study in 1 Timothy, just talking about how a pastor should behave, kind of transitioning from Paul talking about how, wives should behave as well, and talking about the inward man and talking about the three things we should be focusing on as Christians: faith, love, and having a good conscience, right? Those three things. So going from that, he begins to talk about how a pastor should behave for good reason. Just because he should have those three things in his life, and he himself should be manifesting these fruits in his life. So let's go ahead and read that in 1 Timothy chapter 3. It says, "This is a true saying, if a man desires the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all dignity. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a new convert, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must have a good report from those who are outside, lest he fall under reproach and the snare of the devil. Likewise, the deacons must be dignified, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy for money, holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience." Okay, talking about the same thing we just talked about. "And also let them first be tested. Then being found blameless, let them serve in the office of a deacon." So we understand that when he says a pastor must be blameless and a deacon must be blameless, the idea is that they're both being tested, they're both being sought out. Do they fail in any of these areas? Right? Is it evident that they fail in that? To us and to those outside of the church. If so, then they might not be qualified to pastor or be a deacon. So they need to be tested. Okay, and that testing period can honestly range for different times and all of that. Really, there's a lot of ways you could test people per se, but time often is the best test. So, so after they're tested, let them serve in the office of a deacon. Even so, their wives, so it's not just them being tested, it's also their wives, right? Their wives must be dignified, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. In other words, in contrast to how many women in church sometimes are, gossiping, speaking evil of one another, did you hear about this person? Or et cetera, et cetera. Or maybe they don't know the whole story, but they're painting the picture of somebody incorrectly, right? So a slanderer, right? Let the deacons be the husbands of one wife, again, just as the pastors, right? Ruling their children in their own house as well, same as a pastor. For those who have served well in the office of a deacon obtain for themselves a good degree and great boldness in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. I write these things to you, hoping to come to you shortly, but if I remain long, that you may know how you ought to behave yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was revealed in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen of angels, preached to the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. So if we recall, Paul stated he'd sent Timothy to Ephesus to watch over the flock there, right? Likewise, he was to set up or appoint other bishops/pastors. And just so you guys know, if you're studying Scripture, a bishop, pastor, and elder are really used synonymously. They essentially mean the same thing. They might have slightly different meanings. A bishopric has more of an emphasis on authority. Pastor has an emphasis of pastoring a flock, and elder has to do with wisdom or maturity. But they're all used synonymously with the same ideas. So when it mentions elders of a church, it is usually talking about pastors or a bishop. So Paul tells Timothy the three core things men needed to stick to be faithful ministers of Christ. And not just ministers, but Christians. Sincere faith, pure love, and a good conscience. If they are men given to fables and endless genealogies, and those direct how they interpret the Scriptures, they shouldn't be entrusted to pastor the flock. If they are men who seek to teach out of the Old Testament, but to store any of those three things, they are not qualified men and enabled by the Spirit to teach. So within that same line of thought, after having previously talked about how men ought to pray with humility towards their leaders, and women ought to live submissively towards their husbands, Peter likewise taught us that Sarah called Abraham her husband Lord, our master, recognizing his headship in the home. So likewise, women today need to recognize the headship of their husbands in the home, and they need to be willing to be humbled, just as a man must be humble before the Lord and before the authorities in the rest of the world. Okay, there is an authority in the home. But right after Paul states this about women, he also states how men are to dwell with their wives according to knowledge, right? So you're supposed to know your wife, you're supposed to understand her, and that they are to show honor towards their wives as the weaker vessel. In other words, just as it mentions showing honor towards the widows, recognizing what they do for the church and their needs, we ought to honor the wives, recognizing what they do in the home and their needs, okay? Properly recognizing who they are and what they do. They ought to treat their wives very carefully, gently, with a desire to take care of them as they are the stronger vessel. They are not to be abusive or lord their power over their wives. And when I say that, obviously we recognize Sarah called Abraham Lord. We still have a master place above our wives in some sense, but it's to a degree where we don't do it in an abusive way. Right? We're not yelling at them. We're not beating them. We're not hurting them. Right? And just as a teacher or preacher is not to be abusive over the flock of God. Now, there is a slight separation between the authority of a pastor amongst the congregation and the husband in his own home. Okay, there is. A pastor's authority and a husband's authority they're two distinct things. But how a husband behaves in his home and how he leads his home does transition into how he's going to be able to effectively lead a church. So the pastor does not hold headship over the man's wife or another man's wife in the congregation, right? So he's not the head of the church in that sense. Christ is the head, right? His office is merely a place with some authority, not headship in the same way of a husband. But regardless, both the husband and pastor are not to rule with an abusive spirit. Furthermore, from the beginning, God told the kings of the Old Testament they were not to accumulate to themselves many wives, right? From the beginning, though you can see examples of polygamy, God was not for polygamy. Okay, his order for marriage is for one man and one woman to give their bodies to one another. When a man marries a woman, his body is not his own, but the wife's. Likewise, when the woman marries a man, she is not her own, but her husband's. So a pastor is to be an example of what orderly marriage looks like. A pastor cannot be married to multiple wives, even as Christ is not married to more than one bride, but the church, which is one. And I get it, there's multiple of us in that bride, but it's still seen as one bride, right? So 1 Corinthians 7, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. In other words, the husband has power over her body. And likewise also the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife. So none of us have power over our own bodies in a marriage. Defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. In other words, we should be giving ourselves for sexual intimacy, because I don't belong to myself. I may not feel like it, I get that. At times, men, sometimes you come home, you've worked a long day, and you don't feel like it. That's just how it is. But you should please her, because you belong to her, and we should be fulfilling her desires. Likewise, she to the husband. It goes both ways, okay? We don't belong to ourselves. Just as we don't belong to ourselves in the church, right? We belong to Christ, and Christ has given himself to us. When two get married, they both belong to each other, nobody else. That is the proper order of marriage. That's why in Hebrews it says that the marriage bed is honorable, but whoremongers and adulterers will be judged, right? Because the only place that sexual intimacy is honorable and considered right is within the confines of a marriage covenant between two people who are giving themselves to become one flesh. Once you go away from that, all right, you can't be one flesh with this person, one flesh with that person, right? And traditionally, and I'm not saying, when I say traditionally, I mean biblically, okay, marriage is the physical union of a man and a woman. Okay, you can't really have that chemical union with a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. That doesn't happen. So the way God designed it was for a man and a woman to get together, to be married in both a covenantal sense and in a physical sense, sexually and binding themselves in a covenant. So, if somebody goes outside of marriage with another person, they are robbing their spouse of the right they have over that person's body, okay? And they're giving themselves over to the other. Again, a pastor must be blameless, okay? He has to be of good behavior. He needs to be a hospitable person. So hospitality, right? If somebody comes in, you give them a drink of water, right? You do these things. You're a hospitable person, okay? He should be known for doing good to others, being welcoming to others. He needs to be someone that people outside of the church actually speak well of. If the unbelievers of our country speak evil of the pastor because he's prone to speak evil and behave wrong, he should not pastor. He should be able to teach, and if a man cannot teach, he cannot pastor. The phrase not given to wine merely emphasizes that he cannot be a drunkard, okay? It's not saying he cannot drink wine or alcoholic beverages. It's just not. And I understand why people are of that persuasion. Now, I will say this. Paul says, if any man is offended by this, don't drink wine. It will cause him to stumble, right? Okay, there is that. I get that. But also understand he clearly makes an emphasis that drinking wine itself is not evil. He even tells Timothy to drink a little bit of wine for his stomach's sake. And I understand the debates about, there's Scythian wine, there's barbaric wine, there's old ways they used to view it all and percentages of water to wine. But regardless, all the wine they had some alcoholic content. So if drinking anything with alcoholic content in it is sin, then all of them were under sin. Okay, it's just how it was and how it is today. God was clearly not against drinking stuff with alcoholic content. Paul repeats this with the deacon, stating he cannot be someone given to much wine. The point is the pastor and deacon cannot be a drunkard. They need to be sober-minded, ready for battle. But that does not altogether forbid them from drinking wine or alcoholic beverages. And the scriptures are pretty clear that alcoholic beverages in moderation are not sinful to drink. Actually, it says this in the Old Testament. Let's go there. In Deuteronomy 14, this is God speaking to the Jewish people about when they come to worship before him. He says, "And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God." Okay, so they're coming to eat before him in the place which he shall choose to place his name there, which is talking about the temple, right? The tithe of thy corn and of thy wine and of thine oil and the firstling of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. So they bring all these things to the temple of God. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, talking about the wine, okay, I'm emphasizing the wine, okay, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there. So they're traveling a great distance to get to the temple of God, right? When the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then thou shalt turn it into money. So the idea is that if it's too hard for them to carry all of that stuff there, they're going to convert it into money. They're going to sell it. They're going to bring the money with them to the temple and bind up the money in thy hand. And thou shalt go into the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. And thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. So understand this, lust itself is not necessarily a sinful word. It emphasizes desire, but there can be evil desires. So saying whatever your soul desires, right? For oxen, for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink. So clearly, God says you go up, and if you want wine or a strong drink, you go get it. Whatsoever thy soul desireth. And thou shalt eat there before thy Lord thy God. So he's saying you can eat the oxen, you can eat the sheep, you can eat or drink the wine and the strong drink before the Lord thy God. In what sense? Rejoicing before him for what he's blessed you with. All right? Thou and thine household. So, wine and strong drink were not considered sinful beverages. God actually encouraged them, go up to the temple of the Lord, drink before me and rejoice. Okay, now understand, this is not wine that was weak. He clearly says strong drink. So that would include beverages like Corona. That would include beverages like Bud Light. That would. Now, am I saying that we should start bringing alcohol to the church? I'm not really saying that, and the reason I say that is because Paul does say, if brethren, if that's something that causes them to stumble, you don't need to be drinking wine, especially not in front of them. Okay, so don't do anything that's going to cause your brother to stumble, and especially you don't need to be bringing wine to the church of God. Okay, but That doesn't mean you cannot recognize wine or beer or strong drink as something God has given to us to bless us. Okay, it talks about in the Psalms how wine maketh the heart of man glad, and it's true. Even today, you can recognize that when somebody drinks an alcoholic beverage, there is some euphoria or sense of relaxation and even a sense of just happiness it gives them, as long as they're not drinking too much. Once you get to the place to where you're actually legally considered intoxicated or drunk, you start to behave sometimes angry, frustrated, or whatever. But when you're below that line and your blood alcohol level is not too great, then it usually just gives you a sense of relaxation and happiness. Okay, it just does. So God gave us these things to enjoy. Um, Again, just another verse to emphasize this. In Ephesians, it says, "Be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess." So you're drinking an excess of wine, you become drunk. But be filled with the Spirit. So all in all, you can enjoy wine, you can enjoy strong drink, but you should not be drunk. You should not be taken over by the thing you enjoy. And that includes anything in life. Um, there are tons of things God has given us to enjoy, but if it completely begins to shape the way we think and distorts us, then we probably need to put it away from us, especially for a time. That's why fasting is good, right? If you're a drunkard and you don't have control over your drinking, then honestly, I would just suggest stop drinking. Okay, that's my suggestion to you. But if you're somebody who drinks a bottle once a week, just one bottle, and by the way, for most people that doesn't get them drunk. Some people it does, but then I'd say that's not that big of a deal. Honestly, if you were to do it once a night even, that's debatable, but I would not recommend that every single night. That's not a healthy way to live. And overall, it starts to accumulate. So you need to take breaks. You need to exercise self-control. Okay, so once again, pastors cannot be violent. They cannot be abusive men. So if a man has major anger issues and has been known to hit or scream at people abusively, he should not pastor. He also needs to have his lust for money under control, right? It is okay to want to make money to take care of your family, but money should never be his sole focus. He shouldn't be driven by these things to the neglect of doing what is right. And then we finally arrive at a point where the two streams of thought connect even more. Wives are to be submissive to their husbands, recognizing their headship over them. And a pastor must be a man whose home is under control. If his kids are unruly and rebellious within his own home, this type of behavior will transfer to the flock of God. If he does not know how to keep his own home in line, how can he possibly pastor the flock of God to refrain from sin and to walk in holiness? The answer is he can't. Granted, it is understood not every pastor's kid is going to be born again right away, right? Not everybody receives the Spirit just because they grew up in a Christian home, and that can affect their behavior to some degree. But overall, if his kids are out of control, he shows he doesn't have the wisdom or understanding to reach their hearts and urge them to walk uprightly with integrity. Honestly, here's the thing. Even unbelievers recognize right and wrong. So if you're an effective husband, if you're an effective father, if you're an effective pastor, even the people in your own household, though they don't believe, theoretically, if you're doing it right, in most situations, you should be able to convince them to submit to your leadership and to follow after your example. Okay? So even unbelievers, even your unbelieving children. So this shows us that if, as a father and husband, the power of our headship does not rest in yelling at our wife or kids to get in line. There must be something more compelling to their hearts to yield to our authority. A house must be led with love and affection. A house must be guided with discipline, yes, but seeing as a wife is not in the same realm as a child, and we can't just go around spanking our wives or, beating them. And honestly, you shouldn't beat your kids either. That's not what I'm saying. But there must be something more that compels them to desire to follow us. Obviously, the discipline you can exercise on your children is going to be a little bit different than anything you'd be able to do with your wife. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. Love is what compels the flock of God to follow Christ. It is not the fear of judgment that ultimately leads people to get in line. It is the goodness of God that leads men to repentance. Likewise, it is the goodness of the husband, pastor, that leads the flock of God to desire to submit to his leadership. Be an example first and foremost as a pastor. You don't have the same power over the flock as you would your own home, right? And that's why he says in Peter, right, that a pastor is not to lord over the flock, but to be an example. Many times pastors who cannot keep their own homes in line are pastors who don't know how to lead. They resort to yelling, to beating, to abusive punishment with their kids, not recognizing they are only provoking their children to wrath, and their wife, right? What woman wants to submit to a man who doesn't treat her right? No woman. So husbands should treat their wives right and give honor to them. And then they'll be more willing to follow in your footsteps. That's just how it is. If you're doing what's right, your family's more than likely going to follow. But when they see you sin, when they see you angry and abusive, they're going to put up walls between you and them. And that's why Paul tells us as fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. You need to be sensitive to the hearts of your children and seek to reach them with love. That is the ultimate way you will shepherd their hearts, and furthermore, the flock of God. Likewise, if a pastor's wife is rebellious and unruly, he is not able to pastor the flock of God. She has to be disciplined as well, just as much as the kids to some degree, right? She needs to be an example. If she's going around like she's the type of person that's throwing plates at her husband at home and stuff like that, like I mentioned before, yeah, you're not ready to pastor, okay? You need to get things in order in your home before you can get things in order in the church. If he cannot guide his home with love and affection, and they are rebellious, he's not qualified to lead the flock. Then also, some of the things mentioned of the deacon clearly apply to the pastor. He cannot be double-tongued. In other words, he cannot be someone who goes around saying one thing while saying the exact opposite at other times with different people. He needs to be consistent. And just as a deacon is tested, a pastor should be tested too. Paul told Timothy, lay hands suddenly on no man. We should never appoint anyone to an office of ministry without first testing their character and determining whether the Spirit is truly perfecting love within them, and they are living according to these standards. And the wives of the deacon were likewise to behave in an orderly manner, just as much as the pastor's wife. Pastors and deacons are not held up to two different standards. These standards apply to both, seeing as they are both leaders, and if a deacon must behave honorably, how much more the pastor of the flock. Paul states that deacons obtain a great degree of faith and boldness in the office. Likewise, any man who is appointed to the office of a pastor will often be shaped and grown by the hand of God in a supernatural way. So, even with all of these standards and qualifications, it is a good thing to desire the office of a pastor or a deacon, knowing that the journey of pursuing these things and the battles afterward will help to shape our character and develop our faith in supernatural ways. Some people hear about all these qualifications and desire to shrink back from even thinking about pastoring or being a deacon, knowing they don't match up. But you should pursue to be in a place where you could be qualified to be a pastor or a deacon. Desire to see these things abounding in your life. And of course, I'm speaking to men in these situations. Both of these offices are clearly for men. Be patient and rule your houses well. That is the first step towards growth. And then if and when you are ready to pastor or be a deacon, God will use that to shape your faith as well. Sometimes it takes people years to finally be qualified to pastor or be a deacon, and that's okay. God didn't call most of the prophets till they were in their 30s or older. God often gives times of maturation to those he calls so that they are ready when it's time. Even Moses was quite a good bit older when God called him to speak to Pharaoh, and he had been living as a shepherd of a literal flock, and God used that to prepare his heart to shepherd the flock of Israel. You don't need to rush things. Let God mold you and shape you to be ready for your calling. Some people think, I'll go to college for 4 years to study the Bible, and then I'll be a pastor. But God doesn't often work like that. And most of the time, They rush into the office and fall into shame. A pastor cannot be a novice. So study the mystery of the faith. Study the scriptures diligently, and let the Spirit of God perfect his love in you. Then in God's time, you will be ready.